Dan Cholet, president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, myself and others have been searching for some time to resolve a symbolically important mystery concerning the very first office location Alexander Hamilton used as the first Secretary of the Treasury following his appointment and confirmation on September 11, 1789 in Lower Manhattan. The location of the office Hamilton and the newly created Treasury Department began using the very next day as Secretary of the Treasury to transform the future of the newly created United States of America. There is clear proof of two addresses which do not answer this question. To make sure there is no confusion here, I will note both. Fraunces Tavern served as the offices for the old Treasury under the Articles of Confederation. That is not Hamilton's first Treasury office. Moving forward, the second headquarters of the new Treasury Department and Hamilton as Secretary was on what was then Dock Street, now Pearl Street, in Lower Manhattan, beginning in December 1789. That is not the first Treasury Department office from September 11th until early December 1789. There are no documents that have ever been found that specifically state the address of Hamilton's first Treasury office. Unfortunately, back in those days, mail did not typically specify addresses. Even places like New York City were so small, the local postmaster and their carriers knew where to find anyone. Further, often a sender would not even know individual specific addresses. Regardless, there is no known mail either from or to Hamilton or the Treasury during this early period, beginning on September 11, 1789, until early December 1789, that includes the address. The one vague location that has been noted by various Hamilton biographers, including Ron Chernow in his widely read and very popular biography, does not attribute his sources, but states Hamilton's first official office as Secretary of the Treasury was on Broadway, south of Trinity Church. An even more vague reference to Broadway can be attributed to another Hamilton biographer, Richard Brookhiser, who listed a source in his book, The City of New York in the Year of Washington's Inauguration by Thomas Smith, published in 1889. That book states, on the 12th of December, 1789, the offices of the Secretary, Comptroller, Register, and Auditor of the Treasury were moved from Broadway to one of the corners of Broad and Great Dock Street, now Pearl Street. That is the only reference in Brookhiser's biography. So, at best, there is very slim reason to conclude that Hamilton's first Treasury office was on Broadway, and none at all that specifies a specific address or location. What I have recently uncovered, supported by logical deductions, lead to a different and very specific conclusion as to where the first Treasury office of Secretary Alexander Hamilton was located. Enough, in my view, so that as first proposed by Lucius E. Cheddenden, Register of the Treasury Department, during the administration of President Abraham Lincoln, proposed that a permanent plaque be placed at this other location in recognition of Hamilton's office as Secretary of the Treasury first being there. That location is in fact pictured on the edge of this official drawing of Federal Hall on Wall Street, the first capital of the United States. Of course, we certainly know where Alexander Hamilton is buried, in Trinity Churchyard, at the corners of Wall Street and Broadway, a place that has always been a popular destination, and ever more so with the popularity of the musical Hamilton. As for Hamilton's office, when he was first Secretary of the Treasury, we have Chernow's reference, unattributed, that it was, in fact, south of Trinity Church. South of Trinity Church on Broadway. Here we are looking at Broadway south of Trinity Church. But there is no factual reason to believe that the first Treasury office was in fact there. So, what do I bring new to this discussion now? A few very significant items. A few Treasury Department documents from March 1st, 1790, during Hamilton's tenure as Secretary of the Treasury, documents in the collection of the Library of Congress, with a reference to rent owed for the Treasury Secretary's office prior to its relocation to Great Dock Street, which was the second Treasury office in December 1789, and references to that move. Also, the irrefutable evidence of Hamilton's law office being on Wall Street during this period in 1789 at 57-58 Wall Street, as numbered in 1789, which, after the renumbering of streets in New York City, and specifically including Wall Street, is the location today of 31-33 Wall Street, and exactly opposite Federal Hall, south of it at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street. Also, the references and conclusions contained in the 19th Annual Report, 1914, of the American Scenic and Historic Society to the Legislature of the State of New York, March 24, 1914, and the section titled Alexander Hamilton's Landmarks, which begins on page 101. This report itself makes the recommendation back in 1914 that a permanent plaque be placed on the wall of the Morgan Building on Wall Street to read as follows. Wall Street, called by the Dutch the Singel, renamed by the English Wall Street, so called from the city wall erected in 1653 at the northern limit of New Amsterdam and demolished in 1699. This building, erected 1913-1914, occupied part of the ancient Shop Way, or sheep pasture of the Dutch pioneers. On this site, at numbers 31-33 Wall Street, was the office of Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. Now, let me add some further context to this conclusion, and why a plaque should be placed on the outside of 31-33 Wall Street. As for the reference to Hamilton's office on Broadway by Chernow, Brookhiser, and others, some that just state Broadway, others on Broadway south of Trinity, and still others on Broadway below Trinity Church. Whoever first made such statements, they were then picked up by various authors. It is not difficult at all that whoever these unidentified individuals were, they might well have had no direct knowledge at all and might well have misidentified south with east in reference to Trinity. Also, that below Trinity could just as well reference Wall Street, if not better than Broadway. Better still, reference to the Treasury documents from March 1790 from the Library of Congress, referring to paying rent for the first Treasury office well after September 1789. It is far less likely that a landowner would have waited to be paid rent for a formerly rented office than if the individual later claiming rent for the first Treasury office was Alexander Hamilton himself, using his own law office as his Treasury office and finally later billing Treasury rent for it. Even more, there was a very brief time, just 1 week, between the creation of the Treasury Department on September 2nd, 1789, and Hamilton's appointment on September 9th, 1789. It is extremely unlikely anyone would have not only rented a Treasury office before there was anyone working in the Treasury Department, but also furnished it and placed various documents there. Hamilton became Treasury Secretary on Friday, September 11, 1789, and by Sunday, a day later, there is confirmation he is already working in his office as Treasury Secretary. It is far more likely where Hamilton was working was right in his own law office across the street from Federal Hall, and logically it took 2 months to find a more permanent Treasury office, rent and furnish it, as was the case with Treasury moving to Great Dock Street early in December 1789. But even if this logic is not 100% provable, and since there is never going to be absolute proof, any original document that states a specific address for the first Treasury office, there is absolutely no doubt in the weeks and days prior to September 11, 1789, Hamilton was working at 3133 Wall Street and preparing the plans that would save the United States and lead to its greatness. And also absolutely true that when Hamilton walked to Federal Hall on September 11, 1789, to accept the appointment as Secretary of the Treasury, he walked there from 31-33 Wall Street and afterwards returned to 31-33 Wall Street as the first Secretary of the Treasury. And that every day he was Secretary of the Treasury, while our first capital remained in New York City, that Hamilton arose each day and went to sleep each day at 31-33 Wall Street. There should be a permanent plaque for all to see for all time, acknowledging Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury, and there will never be a better place than the wall of 31-33 Wall Street. Let's make it happen.